Hello, my name is Dr. David Hirsh from Harvard Medical School, and thank you so much for inviting me to this meeting on the new paradigm of medical education in the post-pandemic era. I also offer my warm congratulations to KMU on this wonderful international conference. So today I'll be speaking about the educational science, the data, and the experience of Harvard Medical School's Longitudinal Integrated Clerkship, or LIC. At the bottom of the screen, I offer my contact information. I thank my colleagues in this work in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the States. And of course, I have no conflicts of interest or any financial disclosures. I did publish a book with my colleague, Dr. Ann Poncelet, but we received no benefits or proceeds. I should point out that I've been in this field for 18 years doing research and leading a program. So obviously I have strong cognitive bias from all the joy over that time. But today we are not talking about traditional block rotations, no. We're talking instead about longitudinal integrated clerkships depicted here. Same clerkships, same material, same high standards, different structure. So these are longitudinal clerkships. And to get us to that topic, I want you to think closely about this image of full integration. So here we start with this happy hand waving and this elbow here, because that reminds us of the work of Peter Elbow, who brought forth the idea of the believing game and the idea of the doubting game. People should entertain both believing and doubting when they have to engage in a new and complex idea. So here you see him saying, first, try to believe everything I'm saying. Even if you disagree with it or find it crazy, play the believing game. At least pretend to believe it. Pretend to be my ally and give me more evidence, more arguments, more ideas to help me make my case better. But of course, after that, also make sure you try to doubt everything I'm saying. Even if you love the idea, take the role of a skeptic or make arguments against my argument. The idea is, for the best possibilities of transformation, we should both open ourselves to the believing and be careful skeptics. And so I hope that happens today in our talk. Here's the image I presented to you of a longitudinal integrated clerkship. Of course, they could have more disciplines or different disciplines, but they have a definition. So the international consensus definition is here from the organization called CLIC. And I can take each part in turn. A clinical education program in which students participate in the comprehensive care of patients over time, participate in continuing learning relationships with these patient clinicians, and meet the majority of the year's competencies across multiple disciplines simultaneously. That's an LIC. So let's look at each of these. Comprehensive care of patients over time. You see the year depicted in red, you see the time. On the right hand or y-axis, you see the degree of active involvement by the students with their patients. And you know, for block rotations, you have some active involvement, but then the clerkship ends. You have involvement with the next clerkship, then the involvement ends. So students do not have increasing active involvement over time. This is a problem. Longitudinal clerkships seek to remedy this by having comprehensive care of patients over time, which gives you increasing involvement. And it's not linear like this graph shows, but Bridget O'Brien and colleagues in 2012 showed well this important advantage of longitudinal clerkships. I give you the reference below. Participate in continuing learning relationships. So we depict this by having the relationships and time, and you can imagine relationships extending across time. Relationships are a powerful formative force for learning, especially when they go across time. And these students are closely connected to their other peers, of course, but also to their patients and their teachers, their preceptors, and the other medical professionals in the offices they work in. Or meet the majority of the year's core clinical competencies across multiple disciplines simultaneously, which is depicted well by recognizing how the block rotations do this. That you finish a clerkship, you finish the next clerkship, and up you go. And the theory is that you build more competence by doing each clerkship. The problem is large, which is, yes, there is increasing competence. That's how many of us got here. But there's also this problem where we lose many of the things we've learned. We lose our knowledge and our skills over time because we're not continuing to do that discipline. So this is remedied. We're going to take the blocks away. It's remedied by the idea of doing multiple disciplines simultaneously so you can increase clinical competence over time because you're doing all those clerkships, all those fields over time together, mixed learning, for which there's a robust evidence base in the LIC literature. I offer some here. So that's the definition. How can we lay out the talk today? I'll make a case for change. Why transform? We'll show how educational sciences get us to a model. We'll show some data and the frontiers of clinical education. But first, the case for change. The case for change rests in 3 domains in our context. The 3 domains are the Flexner Report of April of 1910, which underpinned all of US and Canadian medical education, ethical erosion, harm done to students, harm, and population and workforce needs that are not met by our current medical schools in our context. So what was this Flexner Report? In April of 1910, he asked us to know that the best education clinically was when there was continuity with our teachers and closeness with our patients. And here's the problem. We have lost our continuity. Teachers and learners are not closely connected over substantial time. And we've lost closeness to patients because patients do not stay within the inpatient part of hospitals for a substantial period of time. We are no longer, in our current context, able to do what they could do in April of 1910 when Flexner wrote the report. We were violating Flexner. Ethical erosion, what is that? It's students' loss of professionalism as a consequence of their medical training. It began, what was first reported, it didn't begin, but was first reported in a paper in 1994 with that title, Ethical Erosion. And the authors showed great harm happening to students from taking part in traditional block rotations. Incredibly worrying material, which launched the literature. And the literature went on to show students decline in their patient-centeredness in their core clinical year. They lose their humanism in their core clinical year. They lose empathy. Multiple studies showed loss of empathy during medical school, notably in the core clinical year on the block rotations. They have blunting of their moral reasoning. They have blunting of their moral development compared with peers. And it turns out, it looks like it's connected to medical professional training and not other health professional training, medical training. And things that hurt students now, unprofessional things happening now, predicts future unprofessional behavior. And it looks like ultimately that temporary relationships, the short term of these blocks, is a large part of the harmful effect. That's ethical erosion in a quick run. And that's a picture to depict ethical erosion, the healthy green flowering plant wrapped up by the razor wire. Our healthcare medical education system is hurting our beautiful blooming students. Population and workforce needs are being unmet by our medical schools. There are underserved geographic locations. There are underserved disciplines and fields of study. There are underserved populations. There are underserved missions like PhD scientists, quality and safety, public health, or leadership. Educational sciences have evolved a lot since 1910, and they can lead us to a new model. We organize this around the idea of continuities. For example, the continuity of care, the student being close to their patient. The continuity of the curriculum, using educational science to make our new models. The continuity of supervision, students being closely relationally connected to their faculty. And continuity of idealism, we will not lose our ethics, our morals, our empathy, or humanism. Underneath the continuity framework, which we had published in the New England Journal, we actually have a bunch of sciences of learning which support the notion of continuity. So we'll take each one quickly in turn. Relationships first. There is so much educational theory published in the West about the strength of relationships as a formative force for learning. There's educational theory and there's educational science. The great work of Carol Dweck is wonderful educational science. And we learn from all of the theories in science about the importance of social learning, faculty and students, the power of the relationship to affect learning, and how we can affect how others learn about themselves and learn by themselves, learning about learning, the metacognitive processes. Dweck was very clear about these so-called self theories that can affect and advance students' learning and their growth. They can have the growth mindset, as she says, and also students' resilience in learning. And these closely connect to relationships over time. Relationships over time, just to see the picture again, basically remind us that relational education is both well-established educational theory across fields and also empirical science. So you've seen the ethical erosion picture, you've seen the bouncing relationships with the clock. I hope that these things are sort of memorable for silly, but memorable. All right, more core science. These notions of longitudinal and integrated. In the field of educational science, longitudinal is often referred to as spaced learning or spacing out of learning. And the word integrated, this educational design term integrated, is often referred to as interleaved, like pages of a book or deck of cards interleaved. So we say longitudinal integrated, and the literature and education says spacing and interleaving. So there's a wonderful paper here that summarizes a lot of the science of spacing and interleaving, as well as also the science of testing for learning. So just to make sure I have this straight for you, longitudinal, spacing, integrated, interleaving, and the longitudinal integrated design, educational design terms, structural educational terms, the latter two empirical science terms. Okay, to understand the spacing effect or spaced learning or longitudinal learning, there's a kind of very complicated graph that's going to come in the next page. So in order to characterize this graph, because it has 3 axes, so that's the kind of thing you don't usually do to your friends, I have to give you what the 3 axes will be. So the first axis is test delay. And as you see here, that's the time between when you finally learn something, the ultimate event of learning, and when you take the test. Now, sometimes it's a test, like an actual classroom test. But sometimes the meaning of test here is the test of life. Like, how much do I retain when it mattered? For example, if I learn a specific skill, let's say to putting an intravenous line, and then, I don't know, 3 months later, I have to actually finally put in an intravenous line. If I learned it, and then 3 months later, I have to actually do it, that's kind of the test of life, right? You have to actually do it in the real world. How much do I remember? How skillfully can I do it? Am I able? What's my competency? So test delay is the time from finally learning something from when you actually have to demonstrate that you know it or can do it. Another axis, another one of the axes is study gap. That's simply, this is the whole point of spacing learning, the time between learn and relearn, the space between learning and relearning. So if I learn something, then there's some time, and then I learn it again, that's the space or the study gap. That's the name, spacing learning, comes from this idea of the study gap, the time between learn and relearn. And the third axis is just how much, I put here this green arrow, how much do you retain? How much are you able to actually do from the thing you learned or know from the thing you studied? Kind of the test of life or the test. Now I'm going to flick to the next slide. Don't worry, I will show you again with these same arrows. Here's the 3-dimensional graph. This axis is test delay. That's the amount of time between when you finally learn something, when you actually have to have the knowledge or demonstrate the skill or pass the test. Study gap. That's the amount of time between learning and relearning episodes. The test score, which is the surrogate for like how much did I retain? What was my memory, retention? How much skill was I able to show? How competent was I? Now, as we look at this, okay, I'm going to put a line on here, this green line. Take it away. See, there's a red line on the real graph, but I'm putting this green line on. I'm intending that you see that green line as bent because the red line is bent. Now, why does it matter that it's bent? I'm going to exaggerate this right now by giving you a different green line to really exaggerate the bend. It's bent like that, right? It's turned like that towards the word test score. So now you see the red line is bending over there. That's why they put the lines in this graph. The reason why that matters is very, very important. It's the whole point of the spacing learning science, which is this. The longer the retention is needed, the longer you want to memorize or hold on to the knowledge, the longer out you have to have that skill. And that's test delay, right? The longer you have the skill from when you learned it to when you need it, the more study gap is needed to stay at the highest part of that curve to maximize your results. I'll stop for 1 second. The longer the retention is needed, the longer you have to know it after you finally learn it, the more space you need between learning and relearning episodes in order to maximize your score or to maximize your retention or ability or your competency. That means if we learn something and then we relearn it a day later, or we learn something and we relearn it a week later, or we learn something and we relearn it 2 weeks later, that's not a long enough, it's not a long enough space and time to have maximal retention in the long term. Oftentimes, as this graph here will show you, you may need months, learn and relearn, but relearn again months later, the same thing, in order to maximize your retention. And even then, by the way, the curve is clearly showing that our retention drops pretty precipitously. But the way that block rotations work, there's not enough time between learning and relearning episodes to maximize retention. They're not following educational science. So that's the point of this curve. Now, much more easy to explain is the idea of integrated design, or the interleaving effect. You need to know only two things. We can block material by type. This is sometimes referred to as massing information. It means you do one subject at a time, and then the next, and then the next. So you might learn, for example, math, and then no more math. Then maybe you learn foreign language, and then no more language. And then maybe you learn music, and then no more music, one at a time. Whereas interleaving, or integrated, means you mix the learning. So as opposed to A, and then B, then C, you do A, B, C, A, C, A, B, multiple things mixed. So what happens when you interleave? What happens when you block? So on the left, you see here, when you interleave and you're tested just immediately after you learn it. So you're tested 5 minutes after you study. Massing or blocking your learning, just doing one subject at a time, is better. But even a week later, let alone longer later, even a week later, interleaving is substantially better for retention. So I like sometimes to show this with a sound effect, because again, I'm trying to help us not forget these images. Here's what happens if you study by blocks. If you cram it in, take the test 5 minutes later, or maybe even the next morning. Block learning, cramming is the way to go. Maybe that's good for the test, but it's absolutely not good for life. And it's not good for your patients if you need to know the knowledge at least a week later or more. Because here's the problem. Boom, right? From 90% basically to 20%. That's how much is lost in only 1 week. But you see with interleaving, the memories are sustained substantially more. And there's really interesting studies that show this. So what's also interesting is this. When you combine spacing and interleaving, they're additive. They're not overlapping. They add up. They each benefit the other. So spacing and interleaving together is better than either one alone. And it appears that relational learning, longitudinal and integrated all together, even better yet. So that is the science that underpins the continuity framework. So let's just look at the continuity for one moment. What does this mean, actually? Continuity of care meant the student should have longitudinal care of their patients over time. The student should matter to the patient should matter to the student. Continuity of the curriculum, the student should be connected to the curriculum over time. It should be spaced learning. They should learn and then have a space and then relearn and have a space, learn and relearn over time. Long enough time, not a week, not a few days, not even a month, months and months. They keep learning and relearning. Continuity of supervision. The student is connected to their teacher over time in each discipline. So the student should matter to the teacher, and the teacher should matter to the student. And then continuity of idealism, that the core values that brought us to medicine in the first place should be the core values that guide us throughout. Far from ethical erosion where these values are lost, we should have these values maintained or even enhanced. So you'll see here in the continuity framework, this goes along with addressing the case for change. Didn't Flexner say the closeness of the student with their patient? Continuity of care. Didn't Flexner say the closeness of the student with their faculty, with their teacher? Continuity of supervision. Doesn't ethical erosion call us to maintain our idealism and not lose our idealism, right? And these are all, of course, relational with people, our patients, our teachers, or relational with our core values or with our curriculum. So that's the way we thought we could have a scheme that addressed our case for change and a scheme that was linked to the sciences of learning. And what did it lead us to? A new model of education that was grounded in the educational science I just showed you. And that was, of course, the longitudinal integrated clerkship. At this point, you've thought, well, I've been listening to this lecture for a long time. What is a longitudinal clerkship? I don't know what it is yet. So now I will show you the model. You can imagine block rotations. We call them TBRs, traditional block rotations, or TBCs, traditional block clerkships. And you know them, things like internal medicine, OBGYN, pediatric surgery, in a block. Longitudinal integrated clerkships are the same material, the same amount. We don't change the material. We don't change the disciplines. We don't dilute it. It's the same stuff, basically. It's organized over time, not in a block. The time is substantial, at least 6 months, if not a year. Now this on the bottom may look strange to those of you who don't do longitudinal integrated clerkships. The top is going to be much, much more familiar, except for there's one problem. See, if we thought of this thought about this outside of medicine, we would never do math for 8 weeks and then no more math again. And then English for 8 weeks, let's say, and then no more English and no more math. And then biology for 8 weeks and then no more biology after that and no more English anymore and no more math either. I mean, by the end of this year, this person is not very good at calculating and multiplying. Their grammar, diction, and writing skills aren't that good, and they've forgotten the biology as well. This is not how we do education. This is how we do education. In grammar school, in secondary school, in high school, in college, and even in a whole array of professional schools, even quite specific professional schools or graduate schools, let's say like music, right? In a PhD in various musical schools, people are learning composition and conducting and different instruments and music theory, right? There's lots of physics and science and math of music. There are many different courses, and they're doing these things over a substantial time. So too in law school and business school. Frankly, across most all of education, it's longitudinal and integrated. But only in medicine do we think the top thing looks like the normal thing. Here, the top thing is clearly bizarre. We would never want to learn something for such a brief time and never do it again. But you see here, the top thing looks normal to us because that's what we did. The bottom thing is actually kind of the standard in regular education. And what's interesting about the bottom thing is it's spaced learning, educational science. It's interleaved learning, educational science. And it sets up for deeply relational learning, educational science and educational theory. So the empirically derived sciences of learning support the bottom, which is probably why all the other fields of education do them. But the top is the one that's familiar to us. So how can we understand this bottom one more deeply? I just pick one field here, internal medicine, but this is true for the many fields. Imagine we just look at internal medicine in a longitudinal integrated way. Imagine the students, I'll make an arrow here. Here's the student. They have a structured cohort, meaning to say a collection of patients who they will care for across the year with their preceptor in that discipline. So in this case, internal medicine. It's a cohort in internal medicine with their own personal internal medicine teacher. Now, to be fair, it's actually this internist's patients, it's not the student's patients, but the students becomes a relevant member of the care of those patients along with their supervisor, their preceptor, we call them. You see here these little black dots that says inpatient, inpatient, inpatient. That's how students usually will see these patients. But you see, that's not how life really is. It's not how diseases really are. It's not how patients are experiencing their disease. This is how patients are experiencing their disease, right? They live in the real world. Sometimes they're well, sometimes they're sick, sometimes they're outpatient, seeing their doctor in an outpatient or ambulatory venue. Sometimes they see their doctor in an inpatient venue if they're admitted. This is the reality of how patients experience illness. And this is a way in which we can understand how illnesses proceed over time. You see, when it's longitudinal and integrated, when the student has their own cohort of patients, duty and commitment drive their learning, and they understand the patients as people with disease, people with diseases. They can be close to the patient, like Flexner argued, all right? They can be close to their teacher, as Flexner argued. They can have their caring be their guide, so they don't experience ethical erosion. They actually know their patients. Patients are not objectified. The students care for these patients in relevant and meaningful ways. They have authentic roles in care. They can even follow the patients across venues of care, bumping into all sorts of other faculty and consultants along the way. They're going on the journey with their patient. Their closeness to their patient is profound. And the ability for them to have some role that helps the care of the patient is also profound. When the student has been with this patient for a long time and then goes to a specialist's office, the student can actually offer something to the patient and the specialist, right? Because they actually know the patient. There are enormous affordances for this model. But if I don't show you the map, you will not be satisfied that there's a way of doing this. So I just show you the map here quickly, and you'll see in it the spaced learning, the longitudinal, the interleaved learning, the integrated, and the relationships that can happen. In this map you see here, the student has different disciplines: neurology on Monday, Tuesday here, OBGYN, afternoon here, surgery clinic, Thursday morning medicine, Thursday afternoon, psychiatry. In this map here, they have multiple disciplines simultaneously. It's interleaved. And this is just 1 week. And every Monday morning or every other, for the whole year, they have neuro. every Tuesday morning. Occasionally they'll miss one, but they have OBGYN, and every week they have medicine or surgery, and they're in the operating room throughout the year. They have all the disciplines simultaneously for the entire year. And yes, when patients are inpatient, they round on them, and yes, they do on-call shifts, and yes, they have core didactics. But you can see here, longitudinal integrated, multiple things simultaneously over substantial time with enough space in between to learn and relearn and learn and relearn. And the students have relevant and meaningful roles with patients who are depending on their own personal student. The data. So I'm going to show you data from Harvard Medical School. There are lots and lots of elegant studies at all sorts of schools around the world. And I don't want to suggest that these studies are any better than anybody else's. These are just the ones that I'm most familiar with. I'm happy to comment on obviously on other studies as well. But over the early years of our studying this model, and we studied it very closely, we have these trials to speak of. So here's the setup. There's the Cambridge Integrated Clerkship, or CIC, that's the program, and that's the intervention group, obviously. There's also the comparison group. So how are these groups made? A pool of Harvard students volunteered to be in the program, and they were chosen at random to be in the program. So they were not selected for any kind of specific traits. They were chosen at random from among the volunteers. And the students who had volunteered but were not chosen at random became the comparison group. So that's comparing volunteers to volunteers. We made sure that there was no difference between the two groups. And the MCAT is a pre-medical test. The United States Medical Licensure Exam is the first part of the board examination. We looked at a series of tests, clinical tests and content tests and attitudes and values and the future practice choices, their perspectives on things. We looked at gender and age. We looked at everything we could and found no differences between the intervention group and the comparison group, between either group and the rest of the class, or between the groups taken together compared to the rest of the class. We could find no differences. So if I don't start off with the test scores, no one's going to listen to me any further. So first, let me show you. The National Board Content Exams are subject-specific exams. At the time at Harvard, there were 4 of them that the students took. The students who were doing traditional block rotations took 4. Students in this longitudinal integrated clerkship took 4. I'll show you them in a moment. There's the board exams, and there's Harvard's core OSCE, which all students must pass in order to graduate from Harvard Medical School. Here are the tests. Now, what I could have shown you is one line. It could have said tests added together, or tests summed up. CIC, the intervention group, COM, the comparison group, p-value less than 0.01. But and a good effect size. But that's not the way to show data. This is a 3-year trial. There were 4 tests, so I wanted to pull the information out. So here you see the 4 tests, and in each case you see the Cambridge group had higher scores than the comparison group, but some of these are very close. In 2 particular tests, they had significant p-values, and again, good effect sizes. In the other 2, after the 3 years, there was not a significant difference, but I will tell you this, importantly. People worry like, oh my gosh, maybe your first class was really, really amazing, and your second and third class, there was no difference. In no year did in any test, did the comparison group outperform the intervention group. So that's important. Secondly, the p-values went down over time, which meant the bigger the N, the more students we studied, the more difference was seen. So it wasn't a consequence of having the first group have very high scores and the other groups being no different. Each year, the Cambridge group performed better than the other group. So over time, the p-values went down and the effect sizes were more robust. Here are the boards. Part 2 of the boards. It's a national board examination given to all students in the country. And you see here the Cambridge group on top and the comparison group is next. And you see the difference in the scores, but the p-value is not significant. Now, importantly, people again would say like, well, gosh, was there just like really good first class in your program that maybe is accounting for this data? No, because the next year, the p-value was significant, p of less than 0.05, which was the standard we set, to which you should say, no, but you can't show us 4 years of data in a 3-year trial. So I'm not making a claim that this was significant. I'm only saying that it's important to know that as the larger the N got, the more students we measured, the more difference we saw. So that's very reassuring. Here's the 3rd-year OSCE exam that follows the core clinical year at Harvard. In no year did the comparison group outperform the intervention group. The Cambridge Integrated Clerkship group was always equal or better. and over the 3 years that had a significant p-value and a good effect size. So taken together, here's how we refer to these data. We say the Cambridge students performed at least as well as, and certainly no worse than, the group that did the traditional block clerkships. How about their experience? So when there's a star here, you'll see it's a p of less than 0.05. Importantly, I think this is kind of humorous when I look at this, the Cambridge students, the intervention group, found the program to be more hectic, more stressful, and were equally likely to call it frustrating. But interestingly, the Cambridge students, the intervention group, also called it less boring, significantly, more satisfying. And by the way, we asked 5 different kinds of satisfying: satisfied with the learning environment, satisfying with the mentorship, satisfied with the learning. Each of the satisfyings was independently significant at a p-value of less than 0.05. So more hectic, more stressful, equally frustrating, less boring, more satisfying, and look at this, more humanizing, more rewarding, less marginalizing, more confidence building, and more transformational. It always struck me that, like, what must a program be for students to call it transformational? So this is interesting, isn't it? More hectic and more stressful. So I actually think that the way to understand these data is like this. Back in 2004, my wife and I had twins. So it'd be fair to say that our lives became more hectic and more stressful and probably equally frustrating, but certainly less boring, more satisfying, more humanizing, more rewarding, less marginalizing. I'm not sure I would say it was more confidence building, so let's maybe leave that one out, but certainly more transformational as well. So that's helpful to think about these data that way, right? When something is hectic and stressful, but aligned with your values, aligned with your hopes, aligned with who you want to be and who you're becoming, that's a different kind of hectic and stressful than when hectic and stressful are in opposition to your values or different than your hopes and dreams. I think it's very reassuring that maybe in some ways this was hectic and stressful. It is hard, it's very hard, but it certainly has all these other very critical values that students perceived. They also were very highly satisfied compared to the comparison group on the amount of mentoring, the atmosphere for learning, the quality of their feedback, and the quality of the clerkship overall. We obviously have years and years and years of these data. This is the one, though, that was perhaps most important to me. I was very affixed, you can tell from the way I presented it, very affixed to the idea of we have to do something about ethical erosion. So we used a tool that had undergone very thoughtful, very careful validation processes, and called the PPOS, the Patient Practitioner Orientation Scale. We noticed that before the clerkship, there was no difference, no significant difference. And after the clerkship, there was a difference in the students' patient-centeredness, which was the first time actually in the reported literature that a structural change in medical education could show that we could reverse ethical erosion. We could reverse that patient-centeredness decline to actually make it not decline and even go up. But a good critique of this would be, yeah, but that's just a pre and post. Is there some way you can be reassuring that this actually was a sustained effect? So over here on the left of the screen, you see that same pre-post study I just showed you, pre-clerkship, post-clerkship. But what we did was this. We studied the students again out there on the right of the screen 4 to 6 years later when they were residents and fellows and attending physicians. I put the lines there just so you can see, but of course we don't know the actual trajectory. So we have the pre-post and then the 4 to 6 years later. You'll notice this. Here's where the students were at the end of the clerkship with a significant difference in patient-centeredness compared to the comparison group. And here's where they were 4 to 6 years later. That difference in their patient-centeredness was sustained. Now, a critic might say, do you have any other data that support this? And we actually have a large amount of qualitative data that we published that also support this. In addition, people might say, yeah, but maybe you turned your students into these happy-go-lucky, gosh, the world is always good, everything's good. It turns out we studied both the comparison group and the intervention group, our Cambridge graduates, 4 to 6 years later. And it turns out that each group had a lot of kind of down feelings about their residency training and the atmosphere for learning in the years since medical school, and kind of the feedback and just the overall sense, the overall sort of positivity was much lower in both groups. And there was no difference between the groups in their general kind of grouchiness, except the Cambridge Integrated Clerkship group was patient-centered on this survey tool that had been undergone such high quality validation. And using that same tool, the intervention group comparison group was not. So there's something important that even when our students were kind of down and down similarly to their peers, they were able to maintain patient-centeredness. And again, it was matched by qualitative data that said the same. In fact, there are really powerful data that show that the students in the Cambridge group were substantially more likely to be advocates. So advocates around health advocacy, advocates for their patients, advocates for social justice than were the comparison group students. So very interesting studies there. Let's move to the very end here, the frontiers of clinical education in the COVID time. Here I show you a number of, but not even close to the real number, of longitudinal integrated clerkships around the world. I put many of these dots on the map, and I thank my colleagues in Australia for also starting this map up. But I obviously it gets tiring on the wrist to keep putting the pins in. But I want to show you the point here. If you grab just like here, I show you the LICs in Ireland. I just pick a country. If I kind of fade into that country right there, you'll see there are lots and lots of LICs in a nation, right? LIC sites in a nation here. When you see one of these pins on the map. So there's a large amount of LICs in the world, even for these pins, and these pins don't represent even close to the right number of pins, as LICs grew worldwide so quickly. So for example, it appears that well over 40% of US schools now have LICs or are designing them currently. Looks like well over 45% of Australian medical schools have LICs or are designing them currently. Many are expanding their LICs too, in the US and Australia and in Canada, where it is understood that about half the schools have LICs or are expanding or developing new ones. So, and this doesn't even include the LICs that are expanding in Europe. And importantly, especially for this audience, notice the purple circle over here. On the right of your graph, you'll see the purple circle flashing around Taiwan, where there's a wonderful LIC. And I just want to celebrate our colleagues here. They've done not only brilliant work with LICs, but also published really wonderful papers. So I just want to commend that team. But back to where we started. This was a conference about new paradigms of medical education in the post-pandemic era. So, how do we think of LICs during and beyond the pandemic? My guess is that having heard me now for this period of time, you may know the answers. Longitudinal education matters when a crisis hits. You see relational connections over time, students with their patients, students with their teachers, these relational connections over time, they allowed the students to have meaningful roles in care, substantially different meaningful roles than students who were not connected to their patients or their teachers, or who had only recently arrived on a block clerkship or only been there for a few weeks, because block clerkships are short. That's why they're blocks. LIC students had meaningful roles, flexible roles, and were able to actually extend care. They could provide benefit to patients, benefit to the health system. What else can we learn from LICs in and beyond a pandemic? Again, I'm guessing you know where this is going. Integrated education matters because students have experience. They actually have experience. They've been doing multiple disciplines simultaneously. So there aren't disciplines where they haven't already been working. So they have basic ability in all the core disciplines of their core clinical year. And when that's the case, they're able to learn and contribute usefully. And they feel useful, which is important for their spirit and their energy, because it's scary to be involved in a pandemic, no? You see, students can serve where needed because students are not limited by their block or by the rotations they've already done or by their venue of care or by any particular discipline. They're multidisciplinary. They have an integrated education. They have the core skills of doctoring across disciplines. They're far more flexible. And I guess you're going to predict the last domain here too, yes? What can we learn from LICs in and beyond a pandemic? The relational education matters. Relationships sustain students in times of stress. Relationships sustain faculty in times of stress. Student-faculty relationships sustain both parties, faculty and student. My buddy, my student, my person I care about, my person who's been with me all year long, is still with me. Relationships sustain patients in times of stress. Those patients still had their students, and those students still had their patients. It is very important to have the power of relationships when things get difficult. So, what can we learn from LICs in and beyond a pandemic? Students did not have to feel alone. They were connected. They were connected to their faculty, to one another. They were connected to the whole institution where they'd already been across the institution. They were connected, relationally connected when the crisis struck. And students can serve. They can actually have a meaningful service experience. They can feel safe. They've been in all these venues. They know these people. They can be enriched. Rather than fearful, they can be enriched because they know the people, they know the places, they know the routines across multiple venues of care. They know this institution. They are part of it. So finally, what can we learn from LICs from and beyond a pandemic? For faculty, for students, and for patients, and for institutions, and for society. Longitudinality matters. Integration matters. And relationships matter. With that, please let me say thank you so much for our time together. I'm very grateful, and say one more time, congratulations on this wonderful conference.
有请抓大龙校长为我们进行接下来的